It's been painful, and it does look like that's not likely to lessen anytime soon, with international borders likely to stay closed until possibly into next year.
Absolutely not going to lessen anytime soon, unfortunately. I think the issue for the industry is, unlike any other, the issue around borders and the fact that both state and international borders have been closed means the industry is in quite a unique position. And then you combine that with the fact that we had devastating bushfires beforehand, and you can see that the industry has been subject to a terrible double whammy.
So how does it survive, Margy? I mean, it's a dire kind of tone in this conversation, right? But there's talk about a travel bubble. Obviously, New Zealand is the obvious one. Talk about with, state borders being lifted, we'll clearly see a lot more intra-Australian travel. But that's not going to be enough to make up for the lack of Asian tourists, for example, coming in.
Certainly not. I think the issue is too that when you look at the average spend of a visitor, an inbound international spends infinitely more than a local tourist. So, for example, your average Chinese visitor spends something like $8,500 compared to maybe $1,500 from a local traveller. And look, I think that things like the Trans-Tasman bubble will be useful and they're important because it sets a precedent for us being able to open our borders to other countries that have got a similar disease management profile. And that will start to make a difference. But the job losses in the industry are so significant now that we're starting to worry about whether there will be a tourism industry this time next year if we don't get additional government support.
And even if you do have the resumption of travel, how much more cost do you have to factor into the fact that the new normal for travel will look very different to pre-pandemic?
That's quite right. And I think one of the most interesting things about what new travel will look like is the larger and much higher level of responsibility that will accrue to travellers themselves. Part of what's being proposed in terms of our capacity to have a Trans-Tasman bubble is that if you've got a cold or you're waiting for a COVID result, don't go to the airport. You're putting yourself and others at risk. So we are going to have to see a changed level of responsibility and understanding from travellers themselves.
When do you envision that we'll get passengers from Australia to here in the United States?
Well, that's a very good question. To be frank with you, I think it's New Zealand first, and if we're very fortunate, that will be sort of August, end of July, August. I think after that, we're probably looking at a range of Asian destinations, potentially Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, those sorts of South Korea. It may not be until, quite late next year, at least the middle of next year, before travel to the US reopens without the isolation issues. So in other words, being able to come into the country without having to go into isolation for 2 weeks when you arrive.
Can you expect the government to extend the JobKeeper arrangement across tourism and services and all of the affected industries? Or is the transition to job seeker and the reality that a lot of these jobs probably won't come back on the other side of this really something that we should be grappling with now?
Look, tourism is a people industry, so unlike many others that can become mechanised or through a whole range of efficiencies change their base, we can't and we won't. It will be all about jobs. But even with JobKeeper, the industry will struggle to get to anywhere near the figures that we had previously in terms of employment. In the normal course of events, there's something like 660,000, 700,000 direct jobs in our sector. At the moment, we've only got 230,000 people in jobs in the industry. Even with JobKeeper, we would imagine we're probably only going to get back up to about 400,000 by the middle of next year if JobKeeper is extended to March.
So we get the preliminary June numbers for retail sales from the ABS today as well. And so far, retail sales has kind of held up, right? Be it as a result of, stockpiling or whatever. But going forward, can the retail sector survive given that we don't have the deep pockets of, in particular, Chinese tourists anytime soon?
Well, look, I think from a retail point of view, from a shopping perspective, there are parts of the industry that have obviously done extremely well. So liquor sales, for example, have been off the charts during the period of COVID-19 lockdown. And I'm told chocolate's done very well as well, which says something interesting about people's home habits. But there are, without a doubt, a whole lot of areas that have done well, homewares, et cetera, as people go into renovation mode. I think there's always going to be a strong place for the retail sector. It just may change a little bit in terms of shopfront versus online shopping. I think it almost becomes a little bit like the working from home argument. We've all been part of probably one of the world's most extraordinary social experiments, working from home, and I think it's going to change the way businesses run their arrangements from that perspective. In the same way, it may have led more people to shop online now and view that as a better option.
Margy, what can the transport and tourism industry do in order to restore travelers' confidence?
Look, I think this is a really important question because the industry can't just rely upon government to fix these issues. So that's why the industry has been so heavily engaged in providing hygiene and safety information across the board and trying to make that a consistent approach in every aspect of the industry, from the performing arts through to cruise to air traffic to hotels, you name it. Destinations everywhere are adopting these guidelines and pushing that out fairly strongly into the public. I think, though, that things like the Trans-Tasman bubble opening are what's going to really help with that confidence factor as people see that return to near normality.
Margy, what's also probably not helpful is, of course, we're getting, Chinese state media issuing these warnings to their people saying that they shouldn't travel to Australia, that they're at the risk of racism. Canberra then accusing Beijing of engaging in coercion. How much of a worry, even without the pandemic, are these deteriorating relations between the two countries?
Look, the Australian tourism industry and China have always had a very strong and healthy relationship. China has been, before COVID, the biggest source of inbound international visitors, and we've always been extremely happy to welcome Chinese visitors to Australia. I think that relationship will bounce back. It's certainly one that the industry is very focused on at the moment, and you'll find in the education sectors, agriculture, manufacturing across the board, all of those industries are focused on making sure that we maintain relationships with our friends in China.